Hello everyone, welcome to Lamakaan. Kranti has of course welcomed you, but I want to do it again because there should be no lack of it. I would like to introduce Srinivas Kodali today to the stage, and his event is Cybernetic Census and the Politics of Numbers in Digital India. Srinivas Kodali takes us through how modern day digital governance treats humans as numbers with the mathematical science of cybernetics, which is used to reshape the republic. Srinivas Kodali is a journalist, data activist, and interdisciplinary researcher working on data, cities, and the internet, and he's also a very frequent regular of Lamakaan as well.
Lamakaan has been that space where I have been trying to explain what's happening or trying to discover and explain what's happening in Hyderabad over the last decade or so. Whether it be NPR, Aadhaar, voter relations. So this talk would be probably a conclusion of those series of talks that I embarked on at Lamakaan, where I found my answers of why are we being forced with Aadhaar. Like, it's a question that kind of emerged basically because of the practices that were being used post 2014 in Telangana with active digitization. And it took me to look at how societies evolved across the world, the US, Chile, Soviet Union, China, to figure out that it's a problem of mathematics. It's no more a problem of society and how society is being abstracted. And these are ideas that mathematicians produced during World War II, like just after World War II. The World War II is a place of important crisis, a crisis which we continue to endure. Like, it opened up, it started creating new nation states. The idea of nation states, if you look at it, when we're questioning India and what being Indian means now, we'll just go back to 70 years, going back all the way to World War II. So at the heart of World War II, there were all these crypto analysts, cryptographers, mathematicians who were trying to understand, trying to bring up new theories and apply them into war. The modern computers came in World War II. Alan Turing built it to break Enigma. And there are a series of mathematicians and their work during World War II which has been kept secret. It has been always considered too sensitive to let other nation states know what is happening, especially with cryptography, which is a science to cipher any form of language, knowledge, communication, right? And the Germans had an edge by using Enigma because of their cryptographic strength. For a brief period of the war, nobody could crack what the Germans were doing. They really had no way into the German communications until Alan Turing and all the mathematical cryptanalysis come into play and break them apart. Now, while a lot of this side of the story in terms of the spycraft, in terms of the espionage that took place is largely known, what's kind of that hasn't been out there is how the sciences that came out of World War II basically took over governance systems of nation states. And this talk is primarily that. So when I say cybernetics, you want to go to the next slide? Yeah. So the reason I'm saying cybernetics and census, right? Census is been a point of collection of numbers. I mean, Janaba Lekkalu, as we say in Telugu, right? What are we doing in a census? We are counting people, counting numbers. Now, if you go into the genealogy of census in the Indian subcontinent, the Britishers actively were trying to understand the population at large, understand the resources here in the continent, and how to use it for their own advantage, which is basically for both control and for economics. Now, my work into a lot of this started because of the Telangana survey of 2014, the Samagra Kutumba survey. I am assuming a lot of you are familiar with what happened with the census, where all of us were asked to like be home, go home wherever you're from if you're migrants, and we're required to share all of the details. So it created basically a population registry in Telangana, right? And it was also created at a point of time where Telangana was newly formed. We weren't sure what was going to happen. There was a bit of, let's say, a crisis sort of environment that was also induced, where we were told if you're not part of the census or the survey, I'm calling it census because it was actually a census. They gave it a survey name to evade some sort of accountability measures, where the state said you're not part of this, then you're not eligible for welfare, you may be somebody who's not from Telangana, and all of the political environment of at that point of time forced people to actually go to their native places. There are special buses which were arranged, and everybody was like forced to submit data. I mean, willingly or unwillingly, they had to be part of the census. And if you're not part of the census, you don't know what could have happened. What did happen? What's the afterlife of the census, right? That's the part I don't think a lot of us look into. We only think that the census is a one-day activity or like an activity where numbers are being counted. But to what end? So the Telangana survey at large created this household level data where like 90 parameters of each household were collected through the intensive household survey. That's the official name for it. Which allowed them to create what they kept calling the 360-degree profile database, or a state population registry. In Telugu they called it Samagra Vedika, but the official English name for it was the Integrated People Information Hub, IPIH. So this is probably the first time, I would say, in our recent modern history, you're databasing people. I'm not saying counting people, but databasing people. And there's a difference in this. The idea of counting is applying statistics, right? But data is much more abstract. It's numbers. So, yeah, as I was saying, the afterlife of the census. So what do you do in a census? You're going around, you're trying to understand the population, you're trying to collect numbers about the population. But what do you do after the census? Right? Where do you use this information? You use it for economic planning and governance. The whole idea of trying to understand your population is understand the resources at your hand. What do you do for them? What are their health conditions? What are their economic conditions? How do you essentially govern your society? And that's the framework that we have given the census for. Now, if you look at the afterlife of the Telangana census, it created the state population registry. It created a new form of policing in Telangana. Okay, actually, it's the policing which led me to look into all of this, right? Like, why is that every form of facial recognition system, for the police stopping us, asking for ID, asking biometrics at every corner? What is this new form of governance that was at play, right? And if you look at it, it's all interlinked. It's the information that was collected through the Samagra Kutumba survey, which then the police department says we're going to build an integrated information hub, which later becomes the integrated people information hub, where the police wanted to know everybody in the society. And this was also a time, like it's within a year of the Dilshugnagar blast in 2013. The police were really not sure what population is out there. And we're talking about a modern state which has been subjected to so much of internal violence, right? From different places for different reasons, where the police are simply trying to understand who the population is, who is your internal security threat. And it all goes back to the census, where they use all of this information and they created a new form of policing which we kind of imported. Actually, it was not something homegrown. Okay, it was very surprising for me to see that this is something that was brought in Hyderabad only. I wasn't witnessing these forms of policing anywhere in India, not even in Kashmir, right? But somehow you are witnessing certain practices of policing that are now very much local. So where was this coming from? So which led me to look into all of these ideas of 360-degree profiling, which the police kept saying, we're going to build 360-degree profiles of all criminals, all method offenders, all history cheaters, and they wanted a a profile of every resident in the state, not just the criminals, but anybody. The assumption being you are a criminal until you're proven guilty, right? So that's the framework we were living in. So all of this took me back to trying to look at the Aadhaar project, being very critical of the Aadhaar project, which kind of even helped us to get the Supreme Court to recognize the fundamental right to privacy. There's a lot of work that was done in Hyderabad because of what the Telangana government was doing with Aadhaar, the Telangana police was doing with Aadhaar, that led us to very critically look at what this system is even in the first place. So, while I spoke to you about what census is, what numbers is, what's happening, I want to take you back to look at what cybernetics is. So, cybernetics is the word that Norbert Wiener, a mathematician, gave to a set of sciences, right? Like, it wasn't just one science, it was a group of sciences. So at largely we say cybernetics is a part of systems theory or systems engineering, which consists of a multiple set of different sciences. It's an intersection of sciences. So you use mathematics, information theory, electrical engineering, automation theory, biological systems, and also social systems. So if you look at what the mathematicians or the early computer scientists were trying to do was to look at nature, and they were trying to emulate nature. The computing systems are essentially a copy of the human brain. The attempt to create the computer was to mechanize human processes. The idea of automation was to look at what's happening out there in nature and how do we recreate nature, or rather control nature. So mathematics is that field which allows us to control ourselves and to control nature. And this science is what was used in World War II to build better anti-aircraft guns. So Wiener essentially said he was working on anti-aircraft guns for the Navy, the US Navy, and he was trying to see how he could improve that automatic firing happens, that the US Navy guns could essentially bring down an enemy aircraft. And Wiener essentially hypothesized that an enemy aircraft that's flying is essentially a bird or an organism. The aircraft may be a machine, but it functions like an animal, a human. Because at the end of the day, it's a human that's piloting, a human that is steering the aircraft. All machines in our society somehow function like humans. That's the whole idea, right? We are creating machines to function like us, or to function or to replace things in nature. We have air coolers, we have fans, or we have any of our systems are essentially trying to replace or give us control over a natural process. And Wiener essentially figured out how to do this by figuring out what he called negative feedback. That you could figure out how the enemy aircraft was flying by essentially looking at its previous position. He was able to predict how the next position of the aircraft could be. So it's prediction theory at a certain level, but all of this was based on what he calls negative feedback, and a lot of these sciences existed before. He just applied them during the war. So the application or his publication of cybernetics, the book and cybernetics or control of communications in human and animal, was published in 1948. But this is also the time there was a lot of evolution in mathematics at large, including in information theory, where you had Shannon, yet another mathematician and cryptanalyst at Bell Labs, who essentially figured out how to quantify information. When I say quantify information, what is the measure that we use to quantify information? Bits, right? So he figured out how you can transfer information without needing to know what the information was. He just abstracted information into numbers. So you could just transfer a signal from the mic to the speaker without knowing what the information is. It could be any information, right? So Shannon essentially abstracted, evolved information theory, or is considered kind of the father of this entire science, where you are now able to abstract information into mathematical numbers. And this was happening everywhere. So suddenly you saw in the 1940s and 50s, post-World War II, mathematics being used to automate society, the US post-World War II society, and then somehow use mathematics in every field of science, from psychology to genetics to economics. So after Wiener published his book, everybody was like, how do we use this new science to start controlling society? Okay, so for a very brief period until 1950s, the Soviets called cybernetics a pseudoscience. It said it's a science of capitalists. It's not actually any real science. It sounds mumbo jumbo. It's probably something we should never bother looking into. But guess who looks into cybernetics? PC Mahalnobis. Okay, at the start of independent, post-independent India, you have all these Nehru's men who are figuring out how do we actually develop India, right? Like, and you had, the Atomic Commission under Homi Bhabha, right? So between Homi Bhabha and Mahalnobis, there was a friendly fight of who gets to get the first computer that India is going to import. Okay, and this is also important because computers were under embargo. The US did not want to share computers because computers could be used to create the nuclear bomb. Right? So they were not willing to share any knowledge of cryptography, how they broke the German Enigma system, how they built the nuclear bomb, or what they even did in the World War. Right? It was like largely kept secret. So part of the computers that the United States didn't want to share to India, the reason was that you're going to use it to build your nuclear program, which was an interest, right? Like for Homi Bhabha and India's atomic plans. But for Mahalnobis, the idea of the computer was, how do we use this new machine for economic development, right? So the first computer which came to India was actually used for the census. It wasn't used for at TFR. So what then actually happens is a bit of Hyderabadi history is that we build our own indigenous computers at TFR, where briefly A.S. Rao, our Hyderabadi, our own Hyderabadi was part of. So anyway, so going back to Mahalnobis and census, Mahalnobis invited Norbert Wiener to come to Indian Statistical Institute sometime in 1954. And Wiener actually comes to Indian Statistical Institute and stays there for 6 months. He gives around 60 lectures trying to explain his work to a emerging new set of statisticians under Mahalnobis who were all going to decide how to develop a new independent India through the census. So there was also a cybernetics group that kind of emerged in CISR, the Central Science, Council for Scientific and Industrial Research, where it was a very small group. It wasn't like an institution in itself, but a department inside the research group at large. So when we look at the Indian census and its afterlife, this, as I keep saying, it's what happens after the census, right? So, and what happened after the first census post-independence India was also the centralized planning. So you needed statistics to do centralized planning, which we adopted from the Soviet Union. And Mahalnobis saw India as this mega system, right? And it's important to understand how these mathematicians, scientists start viewing democratic systems as a form of social systems at large and not essentially processes out there that could be controlled, that could be shaped, that could be gamified. I mean, if you look at what the evolution of game theory and its application in cybernetics in itself is all that. So for Mahalnobis, who was looking at India as this mega subsystem, cybernetics was not something that he applied. He applied statistics. Okay, cybernetics was not applied into the Indian census until 60s, but he was engaging with Wiener. So he started looking at statistics as a technology. To Mahalnobis, statistics was not numbers, not mathematics. It was a technology, right? So what are you doing with statistics? You are trying to essentially give a certain form of meaning to these numbers, where you are analyzing these numbers and then you are using those statistics to control an entire mega system. Next slide. So, like, this was his macro plan, right? So you have all these resources that you have, which you know through the census. You know how many people you have, what are the skill sets, what kind of money you have, what are your materials. And then you have all these subsectors. You have agriculture, transport, power, and industries. Now you have to use the numbers you have from census, apply statistical operations to somehow make your 5-year plans. It is in the second 5-year plan that Mahalnobis starts applying applications of operations research, which was largely used in management, which I hope a lot of you already use them, into the second 5-year plan. So you're not just using numbers, you're applying these algorithms, applying these mathematical operations to give shape to systems which would build your modern India. And that systems were built, developed, part of your centralized planning, part of your 5-year plans, and every 10 years you would then go and collect more information to see what you need to do. So the cybernetics group in CISR was made familiar to Norbert Wiener's work when he visited ISI, which led to 3 different groups. One was at ISI, one at Delhi University, and also within the scientific community, to start looking at how do we apply cybernetics to census. And that happened sometime in 60s. And 1960s is when you start looking at how do we then take some of these ideas of feedback, which Wiener coined, to start looking the census from a cybernetics lens, which they kind of walked into or strategized into through applications of operations research from the second census. It was actually this cybernetician called Stafford Beer who took cybernetics to management. which kind of inspired a lot of these new emerging cyberneticians in India, saying, how do we use cybernetics in every system out there? Stafford Beer's work is kind of legendary out there. Everyone's trying to discover the role of cybernetics in their own countries, the way I have tried to do in India. Beer worked in Chile before 1970s during Salvador Allende's government, before it was brought down. They were trying to build a cybernetic system called Project CyberSyn, which was essentially a centralized form of system where they sought feedback from production systems from factories, and they had a centralized computer set of centralized computer networks which they would use to figure out how to run Chile in a democratic way. And Beer starts thinking about applying Marxist principles or ideas of freedoms into cybernetics. So there's a body of work that Beer generates, which was also inspired from the Soviet scientists. So when you talk about capitalist cybernetics and the communist cybernetics, Russians eventually started looking at how do we use cybernetics in their own planning post around 1955. So by the time Stafford Beer comes out with his book Cybernetics and Management, we see an emerging body of work in the United States, in Soviet Union, in India, and also in China. So to understand this deeply, like what is cybernetics? I mean, come on, like it's made up thing, just the way that the Soviet scientists thought. If one looks into what cybernetics was used in China, it all becomes clear. It was used to do plan their one-child policy. So the Chinese cybernetician, one of its leading scientists, Xu Huan, I'm sorry if I'm pronouncing it wrongly, but he was their leading ballistics engineer. And this guy was actually in the US. He was at Caltech. He was part of their aeronautical group. So he starts working on the United Nations aircraft programs, right? So after the war, you have the McCarthyist era in the US, where you're trying to figure out who is a Soviet spy, who is a communist spy. And you're purging everyone in all of your scientific community. So this Chinese cybernetician was also like kind of kicked off. He was sent off to China. He went back to China, and then he started working on China's ballistic program and missile program. So essentially, as these control systems, cybernetics were primarily used how to figure out how do we build better missiles, better anti-aircraft systems, how do we essentially control these machines that we are trying to build. And they later figure out China as a problem that we are having excessive population. If you're starting to apply statistics to manage your economic systems and you're trying to develop, the population growth is suddenly a problem. So they figure out the only way that China can control or have a better economic development is to start regulating the population. And they compute what could be an ideal population for China. So use some of the principles from cybernetics, use computers as back in 60s and 70s to decide the optimal population for China. And you start applying, you start applying cybernetics on human beings, right? So the application of cybernetics in China was bad. Okay, I mean, there is no other way to say it. What the one-child policy did was that it created, like they started ruthlessly applying it in rural areas. So you had people who are having a second child. Now they can't go to the state and say, I have a second child. So you had a generation of what they called the black children. Children who were not registered with the state. You existed, you were a human being, but you are not recognized by the state anymore. Because if you register with the state, somebody gets punished for having a second child, right? And this essentially meant this entire class of the black children couldn't access their welfare systems. You couldn't access the Chinese education systems, you couldn't access their hospital systems, nothing. And this is like 70s. But applying cybernetics on population, China did actively try to control its population, which at a certain level we did too in the 70s in India. I'm still trying to see if there was any role of statistics in this policy. I haven't found any evidence yet. So, can you go to the next slide? Yeah, so you have like cybernetics being applied in different nation states for different purposes. And it's not one science, right? It's like, it's a group of sciences that you're trying to apply in different systems. You're applying them in your military systems, you're applying them in your aerospace systems, you are trying to build economic systems, you are applying them in defense, R&D, and in the US in particular, what cybernetics led to is all of your automation systems. If you're talking about your cell phones, the idea of AI was cybernetic system. It just got branded as AI, right? So you are building what they call cybernetic eye, cameras, you're building new forms of technology, laser systems, optical systems. This science essentially helped people figure out how to build a series of important innovations across human history. In USSR, after they eventually figured out it's something really important that they have to start competing with the United States, they start creating cybernetic councils and institutes for cybernetics. And you are starting to look at how do we use this science to apply to solve problems. So you're looking at building new computer systems. And when you're talking 50s and 60s, the IBM still having those mainframes. I don't know how many of you here actually know a lot about computing history, but even in India, we were solely dependent on IBM to import those computers for our banking systems, for our economic transactions, for planning. Everywhere it was IBM. The Soviets probably tried to build their own versions of it, and the institutes for cybernetics were the place where Soviet Union was building their computers. And India was essentially getting computers both from the US. We had our own indigenous program at TFR, and we got few computers from USSR as well. And the location of these computers was obviously at the scientific centers and the Indian Institute of Technologies. So, yeah, so now the question with India's applications of cybernetics kind of faded down, right? Like each of these nation states applied it in different scenarios, and by 80s, cybernetics was lost. It was replaced because of the emergence of personal computers, the emergence of Silicon Valley, and the creation of computers essentially created a new set of people, new set of thinkers, new set of engineers, computer scientists and engineers, who were now trying to apply how to use personal computers in management, in designing new systems, in designing payment solutions, in designing how to use them in banking operations. And cybernetics kind of around this period between 70s and 80s created these visions of world, right? Like in the United States, people wanted to see if we can replace the state with a cybernetic system. By that I mean there were these anarchist groups who saw cybernetics as a place, Buddhist anarchist groups in particular in the United States. Okay, and they considered Buddha as one of the first cyberneticians. There's a religion aspect to it, which I don't want to go into. But they saw cybernetics as a place which you could use to escape the state. And they actively built this. It was actually the left which built this. Norbert Wiener, like Mahalnobis, a lot of the scientists, it was not the capitalists whom we tend to blame, which I also did, that is responsible for whatever we're looking at. But there was this hope that cybernetics could help us build a better world, build better systems. And these imaginations were so powerful. In the USSR, you had people, part of their Institute for Cybernetics, thinking of electronic cash as back as 1970s. Okay, I mean, UPI, there. And this was even being looked into the United States. Okay, so, and to give you what kind of imaginations this led to, have you seen Godzilla versus Kong? Mecha Godzilla? Anybody from pop culture? Okay, sorry, I don't have any teenagers here. But the ideas of Mecha Godzilla was that you could control an animal with a cybernetic brain, right? Like you can now have not robots. Robots are fully automatic, right? Fully, they are machines. They're fully machines. But we are talking about part animal, part machine. And that imagination is what people thought of when we call thinking of looking at cyborgs. Cyborgs were part human, part cyber organism, right? So you could now think of at least building cyborgs, dead human beings maybe, whom you can revive, reanimate them with a cybernetic brain. Okay, so cybernetics like just took over imaginations of every science out there, including pop culture. And the peak of this imagination was probably Neuromancer, William Gibson. If some of you have heard of Apple trying to create a new show of Neuromancer, William Gibson wrote this science fiction novel called Neuromancer, which is a trilogy. And he imagines this cyberpunk society. Okay, cyberpunk being a genre of culture, punk being rebels in cyber from cybernetics. William Gibson is credited largely for creation of the word cyberspace. The ideas, the emergence, the genealogy of these words all goes back to these ideas from these mathematicians. Gibson was called or sent to Singapore by Wired magazine in 1994. Gibson was this writer who could predict the future of a cybernetic world. He asked, the Wired magazine asked Gibson to write a non-fiction essay of what they thought Singapore was. In 1994, Singapore was an imagination that the World Bank was trying to expand across the world. Right? 1997, we have Chandrababu Naidu saying, I'm going to build Singapore in Hyderabad, make Hyderabad Singapore. Now, to understand what's happening in Hyderabad, you have to understand what happened in Singapore, and you have to understand what all these people thought of Singapore. So, Gibson, who's like, as I keep saying, is a very celebrated writer, wrote a 4,000-word essay titling Disneyland with Death Penalty. Okay? So that was his title for Singapore, which he called a clean dystopia. Okay, I mean, for what we have been sold, that Singapore is such an amazing society that Hyderabad is going to become, right? And we have become Singapore, if you now ask me. What is the idea of Singapore? You have a single party state, you have no opposition, you have no democratic choices, the state determines what they want, the state has control over anything, that's what we are becoming. And Gibson predicted all of this in his science fiction novel. Now, I know I'm kind of telling you history here and what's happening, but to imagine this, you probably have to go to fiction instead of reading mathematics. It's boring. I mean, you're really asking me to give you mathematical equations for a democratic system, it's hard. But that's what writers like Gibson try to tell us what is the cyberpunk world, what is the cybernetic world gonna look like, where capitalism takes over everything, the nation state is actually serving capitalist entities, but has control over everything in our society. So, sorry, can you go back? So, some of these imaginations, right, like they're across the world. Estonia, it's a small, tiny nation state with the population of Hyderabad or less. Okay, and we have a huge relation to Estonia. So, in 1989, post the fall of the Soviet Union, Estonia becomes a republic. It joins the European Union. Estonia had one of the Institute for Cybernetics. And Estonians, what they start doing is, the people in Estonians Institute of Cybernetics start a company called Cybernetica. Okay, so Cybernetica says, you know what, 2000, Y2K, this is at the heart of Y2K. 1997 is when Hyderabad suddenly starts becoming part of the supply chains of IT globalization, right? And you have the Estonian firm saying, we're going to start using cybernetics to build solutions for the Y2K problem and for a digital society. So Estonia is the place where you see cybernetics being transformed into a new digital society. 90s is this time where everybody's thinking of, how do I build a digital society? You have Naidu here telling, I'm going to have a digitized systems everywhere, there's no paperwork. All of these visions came from Estonia. So Estonia had an e-parliament, no papers. Okay, how did these ideas from Estonia suddenly come to Hyderabad? Because they were linked through the transnational networks of World Bank. Okay, so everything that was happening in Estonia, we were trying to redo it. Me Sevas came from Estonia. The emergence of the unique ID program happened with Estonians creating their Estonian EID, which became part of the proposals in India post the Kargil war and the 1998, we created something called the National Task Force for Software and Hardware. By the end of 2000s, its last meeting in Hyderabad, they suddenly say, we are going to have a smart card, part of your software and hardware frameworks. In 2006, Andhra Pradesh starts what is called the AP Smart Card project. And this becomes Aadhaar. And it's in census of 2010 where you start now numbering Indian citizens, where you start giving everybody a unique ID, right? So this is, and the census is a very point of conflict that we need to look into. And what changed, like in cybernetics per se, or application of cybernetics in census from the 60s, from 70s, is that in the 2010, by 2010, they want to start applying it on human beings instead of systems. Usually we are applying statistics for a sector, for a population. You're not applying it to an individual. With Aadhaar, you start applying algorithmic governance, statistics and mathematics on the individual. Okay, it's transition from the place of applying these sciences to a larger body of system to the individual in itself. And these ideas were taught by Norbert Wiener. He kind of explains all of this in his book called The Human Use of Human Beings, where he looks into all of this, where he actually predicts what if we apply cybernetics to human beings. It's a beautiful read. It has no mathematical equations. So it's actually written for the normal public, the general public. So if you want to read Wiener, you should read The Human Use of Human Beings, where he tells, look, cybernetics is that science we can apply on systems. We can also potentially apply on democratic systems. And He wrote this in 1950s when he saw what Senator McCarthy was doing in the United States. So he knew what the problems were. He says the problem with cybernetics is not, on applying humans, is not that we will become a cyborg. It's that some of these human beings will start controlling other human beings. You'll have one section of the human population who have the power over this information and control systems to control the rest of the society. That's what Norbert Wiener feared. And with Aadhaar, we are potentially there now. It's not complete. The Aadhaar project's not complete. Okay, so if you're asking me what is Aadhaar, it's just a number, right? But in what context? You're using that number for economic development. All of our Aadhaar data now needs to be shared with private parties through KYC, which is customer acquisition, right? You're using this information to build these economic constructs, whether you're calling them national information utilities, but they are economic systems. So you're now calling them digital public infrastructures, UPI, Aadhaar, each of these systems. And you're using them in welfare schemes. And you're also using them in policing. You're using Aadhaar to police who is what, you're creating profiles of them, you're creating profiles of citizens. The idea of population registries is not a Modi phenomenon. It is something very old. The 2010 census is when we start creating the National Population Register. And the idea of NRC, again, is cleaning up these databases, right? So there is this phenomenon in cybernetics. We call it self-correcting systems. So if you launch a rocket, a missile rocket, and you want this rocket to hit a target, and it sways path for some reason, but you want it to correct itself. It uses its, again, the science that Wiener proposes, where it uses its previous positions to figure out how much it has deviated and corrected back to navigate itself. So these systems are self-correcting. And if you're talking of applying some of these principles to democratic systems, your NRC and your all of the system that you have created, from birth to death, they want us to use Aadhaar everywhere. When we die, when a death certificate gets generated, that death certificate is required to my next generation to start claiming property, which is why we are now linking Aadhaar to every property, for land records, for vehicles, wherever it is. So you have now a self-correcting system where every human is tracked the moment they are born till they die and their next generation. And the issue that is at the heart of everything is representation. I know what's happening with the economic systems, we know what's happening with the policing systems, but there is no reason, like Mr. Nilekani needed Aadhaar to create a software industry. The police department wants to know everybody. We know why they are doing what it is, and we can accept some of this, right? I can accept capitalism, I can accept surveillance. There is no need for Aadhaar to be linked with voter IDs. And that is where the real challenge lies. And these experiments happened right here in Telangana. The 2018 assembly elections, where we saw a lot of people who could not vote, was the direct result of this experimentation of linking Aadhaar to voter ID. The Estonians have figured out how to create e-voting, which they have been trying to sell it to everybody, especially in the Europe. And everybody in Europe has been resisting it. It's in India probably where we are going to be sold, where we're going to create it with the ideas of one nation, one election. Right? Can you go to the next slide? Yeah. And so if you're asking me what is cybernetics doing to Indian society, and this language, I'm using this word because we are being kept in dark. We've always been told Aadhaar is for welfare, Aadhaar is an identity, Aadhaar is this and that. But this is how people in power have figured out how to control populations. So if you're asking me what is happening, there is a process of datafication, right? We're linking everything with data. Everything from your economic systems, from your social systems is data. But what is data? Data is abstraction. What are you abstracting? You are abstracting everything. With Aadhaar, you are abstracting a human being to a number. And this very process is dehumanization, where you are ignoring the body and you are only treating them as numbers. And we're talking about control, right, when we talk about cybernetics. So where is the control happening with Aadhaar? I'll give you like few crores of Aadhaar numbers. Can I control these few crore people? No. The control happens over the systems that we are building around Aadhaar. What systems? The Aadhaar voter ID system, for example. That is a system of control. Okay, a policing system built on top of Aadhaar. That's where you are trying to control human beings. Digiyatra. Digiyatra is a control system. You are having access to an airport and it's a control mechanism which is saying I will let you pass or not. These are all control systems. Now, it's through this mathematical abstraction, what you're doing is you're abstracting everything, right? So when I abstract a human being into a number, I can start applying phenomena to it. Like we keep hearing data is oil, data is money, data is cars, data is everything. Data is abstract. So you can apply it any properties and it will happily take it. So it's numbers and you can make numbers do anything. And this very abstraction is allowing us to build a centralized India. So on Aadhaar, I build a Aadhaar-based health system, Aadhaar-based voting system, which is why they keep calling it stacks, India stacks, right? You're layering on systems. And this is the design of the internet too. It's not a new thing with these systems that are being built in India. The internet has a layers of protocols where information is being shared. Your phone is an abstraction, right? Like you have apps, you can book things, you can do anything. It has a whole lot of layers of abstraction. And what sort of abstractions you can apply? Commodification, financialization, assetization, you name it. Okay, so it's the mathematical abstraction that is allowing you to now start designing these systems. And early anarchists in the Silicon Valley realized this is a bad thing, the way how the internet was being designed, or if you don't design it in a better way. They start applying cryptography and build the internet systems to safeguard privacy. The idea of encryption essentially comes from cryptography. Most of your systems are encrypted, right? Signal app that you're probably using was designed by an anarchist. Okay? But we don't have that luxury with Digital India systems. Okay, your systems are being designed to centralize. And all of this to create new ideas, to reshape India, to create that one idea of one nation. But mind you, this is not necessarily coming from a right-wing ecosystem. You want to turn India into a single market. Billion people, billion consumers. Right? Your ideas of GST, your ideas of one nation, one ration card. Mr. Nilekani calls it internal globalization. Okay, what a globalization did to the world, he wants it to be done to India to create his beautiful single market. And that single market can't happen until you have a single party state. And that's how you're reshaping India. Yeah, so I know it looked like I didn't talk much about the census and I focused more on cybernetics. But I want to show you what cybernetics was doing and what was the place where this was all happening, which was the census. Even with the caste census right now, the socio-economic caste census that took place in 2011 was being used to build these 360-degree profile systems. It's the systems that are being built around the numbers, around replacing democratic systems when you're digitizing these systems, the problem, the way you are designing them, the code, its architecture, what's happening through these systems. And they don't want us to know what's happening. Until the late, very late, it has happened. And what is going to happen with the census 2025, I'm hoping that's when it's going to be, is that you have the concern of the CAA and the NRC. And this needs to be done, okay? And that, the reason I say this needs to be done is not because the BJP wants it, okay? The systems are designed this way. The statecraft, the bureaucracy wants it. Okay, and the CAA was kind of happening, or the NRC was kind of happening in Hyderabad, with the police going door to door and asking Aadhaar number of everybody. We sent UIDA a few numbers saying these people are not citizens, you please remove them from, deactivate their Aadhaar numbers. Right? It's not just a Assam phenomenon, it's not just a BJP phenomenon, it's statecraft. So you have a host of issues. There's the whole issue of delimitation and representation, the issue of one nation, one election, Aadhaar-based electoral systems. I mean, you even remove Aadhaar, but you bring any digitized electoral system, that's how it's going to be. The idea of creating this nation, CBDCs, central bank digital currencies, which are programmable cash, right? Like you can design currencies which can only be used for a certain activity. I can only use my cash to buy food, nothing else, right? Very dangerous idea. But that's how they want to control the economy. So I'm sorry I brought into the census in itself, but it's again, we are implementing a part of centralized planning through a cybernetic system, and the census of 2025 is where a lot of these ideas will come together, and we will see whatever has started with Aadhaar in 2010 census is going to end. Yeah, and that's it. We just need to prepare for it, and I'm not going to only say it's about the census anymore now. Now that you want to use some of these ideas of AI, cybernetics in a certain way, to society at large.
We do have time for quick questions, so if anybody has a question.
Thank you so much. Like, so I work at an NGO, and like we work closely with government on various data projects. So this is a very different perspective. Thanks for that. But we do need an alternative, right? There's no other way about it. Like one reason for UID, like in a simplistic sense, is also to have a unique identifier for each person. It's not just dehumanizing them, because in that sense everything else is an abstraction. Because you spoke how fiction is good in explaining things, but fiction itself is abstraction, right? So abstraction is everything around us is abstraction. Money is abstraction, everything is. So, but we do need a number to uniquely identify a person, right? Like uniquely identify anything, and majorly to carry out governance. It's quintessential, irreplaceable.
Is there a question?
Yeah, it's a hard to,
alternatives on it. Yeah. Okay, I'll take few more and try to club them. Yeah.
What I felt is, apart from all the abstraction, data and everything, is in my small, limited understanding of things, feeling comfortable within one's own self requires a certain element of privacy, which is what I see is largely getting compromised in this, wherein we wouldn't know who's having eyes on us, on the things we do or don't do, or likely to go, blah 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 blah, what we are reading, who we are interacting with, and all of these things. So from the privacy point of view, it does seem like a concern, the kind of things that we could learn today. Would you have any thoughts or ideas about how individuals can go about maintaining their privacy as much as it is possible, considering the kind of things that are there? Thank you.
The question is, when humans are just a data point, but humans are humans. Humans can think. Humans can decide. So Yeah, considering database and humans can think, so they can rationally think and they can judge. That's where even though they make a database of that and try to implement schemes on that, but when it boils down to the fundamentals, one nation, one election, and all that, but human gets to choose. Though system can influence, but humans get to choose. So how do you see this?
Yeah. Okay, I'll answer these three and I'll take a three more after that. In terms of alternatives, there can always be alternatives. And when I say dehumanization, I'm talking about the idea of algorithmic governance. Okay? The process of abstractions where you're saying humans are now numbers. But in what context is that happening? It's happening in the context of governance. Okay, that's where the problem is. Okay, so if you and I talk to each other, we talk in abstract terms, we use in the internet to communicate, which is also something that's coming from these abstractions. That's totally fine. Okay, I'm not treating you as an AI. It's when you are applying these principles in governance, where the state is starting to treat you as numbers in the ideas of digital governance instead of human beings, right? So you go tell the state, I'm a human being, I exist. But the state is like, I can't recognize you until you digitally verify, until you give me your Aadhaar, until you abstract yourself to the number. That process is the dehumanization process. Okay? And in all of this, I'm not saying mathematics is bad. Okay, when I say the abstraction that mathematics has done to all of that. Okay, it's just that we need to understand what it is and in what context is it being used. And I'm also not saying data is bad. I'm saying the control systems being built around the data are bad. Aadhaar is not a single number. It's not identity. It's a system. What systems are you building? Everywhere you link it, you create your systems of control. That is the problem. Now, can we think of better alternatives? Absolutely. Are you asking me to propose one? I've realized I shouldn't. Okay, no, really, okay. There is a reason for it. In tracking all of this, I may be thinking in a certain way, which is probably not good at large. But how do you then think of alternate systems? You allow social participation. With Aadhaar, since it was being built, the only thing we have always been saying is, why is there only one guy who decides all of this? Why is there only one man who knows how to do everything in this country? With Aadhaar, with UPI, with everything, GST. Why can't you allow other people? And I'm not saying me. Okay, I know people from different communities who are affected by this, and those views will not come out if you're asking me to give you one more imagining India that has gone so miserably bad. Okay, in terms of privacy, right? So, privacy is something we evolved as a right, as an argument against Aadhaar. But when you look at the scale that this is happening, right? It's digitization of society. Your communication systems are digitized, social media. Now, what it's doing is, it's giving control, but control to whom? To the state, to platforms like Facebook, Twitter, all of them, to censor you. Now, censorship is a completely different phenomenon, nothing related to privacy. Okay, but it's a form of control. There's censorship, there's privacy, and there are other issues, right? So I think we need to start looking at beyond privacy. It's just not about privacy anymore. Privacy was an argument which was used to stop it when it was at a very early stage. This system has become now a giant. It's become a Godzilla, right? You can't now say that I will use one constitutional right where all of your constitutional rights, including representation, are under threat. So we need to start looking at it from that lens of control, where these are systems of control that are being applied on human being at every stage. If you are talking about ideas of different rights that humanity has evolved, every single right has been abstracted down and is being controlled. Okay, so, and the idea with explaining this was that privacy is just one right. We have a right to speech, right to assembly. How is right to assembly being now stopped? Facial recognition. It's not just privacy anymore. It's your very right to move around. You're being controlled to even move where you want. Like take the farm protests in Delhi, right? So let's start evolving and trying to understand what these systems are. Privacy has been a good run, but we lost it. We may have won the battle, we have largely lost the war. Okay, where we allowed these people to do whatever they want. And trust me, none of the people who design these systems know anything. We showed so many problems about these systems. To the bureaucrats, to the capitalists, everybody, they don't care.
I feel threatened of control, etc. Would laws come up to protect me? Or would public reaction come up in time to save this?
So now, are people, in terms of the psychology question, going back, sorry, I missed there, is that there are human beings can think, we have a choice, true. So when we talk about technology, when all of these systems, there is, when you look at Darwin, evolution, right? So there is this whole ideas of determinisms. There is technological determinism, there is legal determinisms, is what factors determine your life. Being born in a certain neighborhood, living in a certain neighborhood now is affecting us because algorithms are saying you live in a bad part of neighborhood, so you'll be criminalized for it. Right? So society at large has affected us in different ways. There have been social factors, economic factors, political factors. Sure, human beings have a choice to think, but these choices are now being manipulated. There is a part of cybernetics and psychology which I didn't go into, but the idea of creating the brain, recreating the brain rather, the cybernetic brain and AI, you had to understand how human brains work, how human psychology work. You're only now able to start applying or recreating the human brain because you understand the human brains, right? So if you understand the human brain, how hard is it going to be controlling it? And that's what is happening, right? They told us Aadhaar was welfare. They told us Aadhaar was identity. They told us so many lies. Okay, they continue to tell those lies. And it works. I actually wrote about this, a large part of this part of a column. I have people who are saying, why are you talking all this nonsense? Aadhaar is such a perfect system. Right? So it's going to be hard to open up minds sometimes. It's not that everybody is able to think in the way you and I do. The scientific process and the scientific method is sometimes hard. Like I didn't bring the idea of mathematics here. I brought in properties of mathematics with abstraction and what it's doing. Right? It's going to be really hard to talk in abstraction, and that's what we do with philosophy. It's all about abstractions.
Srinivas, I agree with a lot of the descriptions that you have offered us, that Aadhaar starts with a lot of lies and continues to be lying about what's going to happen. I'm not so sure I am completely with you when you make the comment about cybernetics is about dehumanizing.
No.
The word dehumanizing, right, is something that I want us to think a little bit more carefully, because the idea of the human from where you're making that comment is actually something very, very historically specific, right? I'm saying this because you think about before the cybernetics systems, before our census, in the way in which Mahalnobis began to work on it, what would happen when someone goes to the government for asking for something, right? First question you are asked is, son of who? Right? You're placed in relationships of various kinds. So the human is has always been, in some windows, a part of large networks. I think what's really important and interesting that's going on right now is that a large part of our governance, historically, since our independence, has been organized around territories. Look at your constituency, they're territory, right? You are so many number of people in one particular constituency, but your politics is actually operating through a whole lot of invisible networks, right? And that's precisely why it becomes possible for people to do all kinds of experiments with this. The reason why I'm mentioning all of this is that I think that it's really important for us at this point of time to think about what kind of politics do we look at. We can't respond to this from a notion of a human of the 19th century or the 20th century liberal self who is an autonomous creature who can think about what to do with the world. Right? That's the one that is being actually attacked right now. So all of that we're getting. I think what's really important is to recognize that these technologies, as they spread, they're also opening up all kinds of ways for small little subversions everywhere. And that's what people are using constantly. And I think that in our cities, in our small neighborhoods, in our villages, everywhere, it's these possibilities of finding networks of resistance, which is one way of imagining what needs to be done, right? Unfortunately, the problem is that when you think about these networks as one way of being, and when you think about the territory as one way of being, you're stuck, because you don't know how to keep making this constant switch between one and the other. And that's where the problem really lies. I just want to offer that as a way of thinking about problems.
I think I need to think a lot more about this. We all need to, because even the idea of AI, right, is all going back here. So I agree with you, and I hope we start to think more on this direction, and I will take leave. It's now about time. Yeah.
Yes, thank you so much, Srinivas.
Okay.
For this wonderful
Thank you. I get
talk.
chai.
As a token of love, gratitude, and appreciation from Lamakaan.
Okay.
Yeah.
Oh,
Can
nice.
have your morning tomorrow.
Yeah.